Hello guys, welcome back to my channel. So this is the first time I show up my face in this video, and I'll do it more regularly in each and every video in the future when I upload and publish my contents on this channel. So my purpose, actually my team that have a purpose when creating this channel is to serve you guys a good sleep via some interesting history facts and stories that was told in a soft and calm tones of voice. So that's why I created this channel, to serve you guys a good sleep every day. So please support our channel by subscribe and like our videos, and you guys could suggest new content for us by leave the comment below, and we will appreciate that, especially the new ideas that viewers give to us, and we always listen. So our main theme of stories today is about the First World War, the most bloodbath world war in the world history. I think this is not the most bloodbath. I think the Second World War is more dire than the First World War, but it's still a remarkable milestone in human history. So uh, in this streak of stories, I will tell you guys stories about how people live, how people survive in throughout this condition. That was a really turbulent times, and people have suffered a lot. So what is that? Please, let's start to our stories today. All right, Part 1: The Battle in the Fog. The First World War was a war of blood, steel, and smoke. But one October morning in 1915, the skies above the Somme weren't filled with fire. They were swallowed in thick, suffocating fog. A heavy white mist rolled over the trenches, covering the entire British-German front. Soldiers on both sides woke up blinded, unable to see beyond a new feet, hearing only the raps of their own breath and vague, hesitant orders from above: "Advance!" And so they fired, not at people, but into the mist. They shot based on guesswork, chasing muffled sounds of shadows in the white. A British soldier later wrote, "I heard screams, boots in mud, and then silence. I may have killed one of our own." Bullets flew aimlessly. Some soldiers claimed to hear English voices from the German side yelling, "We are shooting each other!" And just like that, the battlefield fell into an eerie, unexpected silence. More than 300 men went missing that day. No one knew who hit whom. Some said they heard laughter, not joyful, not mad, but a desperate laugh that only a man lost in chaos could produce. Perhaps it was the only battle where both sides, enemies on paper, were exactly the same: blind, afraid, and utterly lost. In war, it's not always bullets that blind us, it's the fog. And when the fog rolls in, it doesn't just hide soldiers, it hides the truth, and sometimes it hides who we are. That is the finish of Part 1. Now, we move to Part 2. The deserter who became a monk. On a winter night in 1916, deep in the dense Ardennes forest near the Belgian-German border, a young German soldier slipped away from his unit. He carried no weapon, only a bag of stale bread and a small Bible tucked into his chest pocket. Leaving the front lines behind, he ran through the trees, over the hills, seeking a place without bullets, without bodies. He vanished. No one ever found him. But nearly 70 years later, a strange, truth emerged from within the stone walls of an old monastery. In a remote Benedictine monastery nestled in the mountains, an aging monk passed away peacefully. When fellow brothers sorted through his belongings, they found a journal. Inside, a hidden confession. The monk had once been a deserter from the First World War. He had arrived on foot one frozen night, pleading for refuge. Refuge. I think so. Refuge. He was given sanctuary, assumed a new name, and never left. He never contacted his family. No one ever knew, except for one handwritten line. I did not flee my country. I fled a mass insanity I could not be part of. No trial, no judgment, because for over 60 years, that man lived a life of quiet repentance. He taught orphans, cared for the sick, and prayed daily for those he may have failed to save. Maybe he was a coward, but he was a hero. But he remains proof that sometimes courage is not marching into battle, it's walking away from one, even when the world causes glory. Now we move to part 3. The Boy on a Bicycle. In 1917, in the quiet countryside of Picardy, France, a 50-year-old boy named Marcel had one simple wish: to do something for the country. He was too young to be a soldier, but he was quick on his feet, healthy, and owned an old bicycle his father had given him when he was 12. While the men went off to war, Marcel's village became a supply point for the army, so he volunteered to deliver messages for the military. Marcel carried no weapons. He carried words every day. He rode 20 to 40 kilometers on dirt roads, delivering maps, medical supplies, army orders, and sometimes letters from mothers to their sons in muddy trenches. Artillery echoed in the distance. He dodged German checkpoints, cut through forests, often going hungry and surviving on berries he found along the road. Once, when his bicycle broke down mid-journey, he walked over 10 kilometers to deliver a single slip of paper containing a retreat order, one that saved an entire unit from being surrounded. He was never officially recognized, no medals, but to the people of Picardy, he was remembered as the boy with bread and orders, a living symbol of quiet bravery. When he died in 1972, at age 17, his tombstone bore one line: Marcel, the messenger of life. That's the end of part 3. Now we move to part 4. Alright, The Poet in the Trenches. That is the title of part 4. It was an autumn night in 1917. The cold wind slipped through the gaps in the sandbags, rattling loose boards and the bones of tired soldiers. In a battered trench in northern France, explosions echoed in the distance, steady, ominous, never-ending. Beneath a flickering oil lamp, a young British officer hunched over a notebook. He wasn't writing home. He wasn't logging a battle report. He was writing poetry. His name was Wilfred Owen, just 24 years old, a former English teacher turned soldier. Months of blood, gas, mud, and death had broken something inside them. Diagnosed with shell shock, Owen had seen too much, too many dead friends, too many hours trapped in filth. But instead of screaming, he wrote, Poetry was his resistance, his lifeline. But Owen's poetry wasn't patriotic. It wasn't heroic. There were no glorious deaths, no flags fluttering in triumph. His poems were filled with choking gas, severed limbs, and dying screams in the mud. In his most famous work, Dolce et Decorum Est, he described a soldier dying slowly from a gas attack, guttering, choking, drowning, and then he delivers his verdict. If you could hear it, you would never tell children that it is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. Owen was killed 1 week before the war ended. His mother received the telegram on November 11th, the day church bells rang across England in celebration. A cruel, bitter irony. But Owen's words outlived the guns. Today, millions of students in the UK study his poems, not to admire literature, but to confront the truth. War is not just history, it is pain, grief, and memory. And sometimes, the loudest protest comes from a bullet. Not come from it, but from a whisper written in verse. Remember this. That is the end of part 4. Now, part 5. Faking madness to escape the war. Not everyone wanted to be a hero. During World War I mean the First World War, while millions proudly enlisted, others simply wanted to survive by any means. In the training camps of Britain, France, and Germany, it wasn't rare to see new recruits trembling, vomiting, even fainting after just a few rounds of rifle fire. But no one gave them time. No one listened. Cowardice, even if born of real trauma, was treated as betrayal. So men began to fake it. Some smashed their hands against walls to avoid holding a gun. Some memorized the symptoms of insanity, rolling their eyes, mumbling to shadows, repeating nonsense. A few did it so well that military doctors couldn't tell if it was real or not. Many chose to feign madness, delusions, paranoia, terror at the sound of shells, in hopes of being sent home. But it didn't always work. Hundreds were caught faking it and sent to military courts. Some were executed, and among them were men who weren't pretending at all. They were simply too broken to explain what was happening inside them. It took decades for the world to understand that shell shock, what we now call PTSD, that is real, that was real. It made strong men stutter, tremble, screaming like children. But back then, to generals and governments, a soldier wasn't allowed to cry. A soldier wasn't allowed to be afraid. So that is the end of part 5. Wow, I really need something to drink right now. Keep hydrated, brother. Now we move to part 6. Part 6. Alright. Here we go. Cats, chickens, and ducks on a submarine. In the dark, crushing depths of World War I's naval battles, where German U-boats lurked silently beneath the waves, sinking anything that moved. There was one submarine that stood out, not because of its crew, but because of its animals. The U-91, a German attack submarine, commissioned in 1917, had a rather unusual rooster. According to post-war logbooks, It once carried at least one gray cat, 3 hens, and 2 ducks. Creatures you'd expect to find on a farm, not 100 meters under the ocean, and yet they became beloved, unofficial members of the group. The cat, named Otto, was picked up from the killed dogs just before the submarine's maiden voyage. He quickly became the ship's early warning system. Whenever Otto froze, pricked his ears, and bolted into the engine room, something always followed: a depth charge, the hum of propellers above, or an enemy plane nearby. No one knew how he sensed it, but no one doubted him anymore. The 3 hens were meant to provide fresh eggs, but they became lucky charms. Each egg was carefully shared at breakfast, a tiny ritual of normalcy in the world of metal and claustrophobia. As for the ducks, they were simply for company. One sailor wrote, "We didn't fear bombs. We feared waking up and not hearing them quack." One day, during an emergency dive after an attack, one duck was accidentally left topside. The captain made the decision: surface again. The crew risked exposure to rescue the duck. We missed a shot at the enemy, a crewman later recalled, but we saved a piece of our soul. In a war where men became numbers and death became statistics, these small, nameless animals, the cat, the chickens, the ducks, held on to something deeply human. They were reminders of the world above, the world of warmth, of noise, of life. That was the end of part 6. Now it's part 7. The soldier who carried a gun, not a gun. In mud-choked trenches of the First World War, where gunfire screamed louder than voices, there was one Scottish soldier who carried a weapon no one expected, a wooden flute. His name was Callum McRae, a folk musician from the Highlands who volunteered in 1915. Instead of stuffing extra ammunition into his pack, he secretly brought a small flute his father had hand-carved from old oak. On the nights before battle, when dread wrapped the trenches like fog, Callum would pull out the flute and play old Scottish melodies, notes light as wind, drifting through the death-soaked earth like a dream. Once, during heavy sailing, Callum climbed down of the trench with no rifle, only his flute, and played a tune as his unit charged forward. No one was injured. The officer later said, "That music made us believe we were still human, even if only for a moment." Callum became known as the fearless piper. He survived 3 major battles without ever taking a life. After the war, he refused medals, keeping only his chipped old flute. Near the end of his life, he said, "I didn't carry a gun because I didn't want to add to the dying. I carried a flute to remind us we were still alive." In war, what soldiers may need most isn't more bullets. It's a song, a breath, a reminder that humanity hasn't been completely lost in the noise of war. That is the end of part 7. Part 8. The body in the bunker wall. In 1923, as workers were dismantling an old German bunker near Verdun, Once the bloodiest battlefield of the First World War, they made a chilling discovery. Inside a 1 meter thick concrete wall, while drilling, they found human bones. Not in a grave, not in a trench, but sealed inside the wall itself, perfectly intact, buried between layers of stones and cement, as if someone had built the wall around the body on purpose. The decayed remains held just one clue, a faded identification tag with the name Hans Keller, a German soldier listed as missing since 1916. After investigating, authorities concluded that Hans had likely helped build the bunker with his unit, but there were no signs of struggle, no blood, no bullet wounds. One theory suggested he'd been accidentally entombed, perhaps during a collapse or a hasty construction order. But a darker theory emerged. Hans may have known something he shouldn't, or refused an order, and someone ensured he would never speak of it, cemented into silence. Whatever the truth, Hans was found not on the battlefield, but trapped inside a wall he may have helped build. We often hear about those who die in combat, but war leaves behind other deaths, quiet, hidden, and forgotten. And perhaps that is the real horror, not just the violence, but the deliberate forgetting. Now it's part 9. The Change Library. In 1916, amid the shell fire and mud of the Somme, a British unit did something that seemed almost absurd. For a war zone, they opened a library. It wasn't large, no shelves, no library cards, just a few wooden crates nailed together and tucked into a damp dugout near the front line. Inside, a pile of old books, histories, detective novels, poetry, adventure tales. They called it the Change Library. The idea came from Sergeant Edward Bell, a former literature teacher turned soldier. He saw how long and haunting the nights were in the trenches. After hours of blood and shouting, all that remained was silence and the darkness of the mind. So he gathered his own books, requested more from home, and built a small corner of imagination in hell. And something incredible happened. The men read, not learn, but to live. Some read Sherlock Holmes to forget the guns. Others found fragments of lost childhood in Keats' poetry. One French soldier even taught himself English with a tattered copy of Peter Pan, turning its pages with trembling fingers. Some books passed through 6 or 7 hands, blood-stained, edges burned, but still treasured. One soldier wrote on the side cover, "If I don't return, let this book keep going." The library didn't win battles, but it helped them remain human in a place built to strip that away. Part 10. Dogs who carried letters across the line of death. During the First World War, across the deadly no man's land where no humans dared to cross, dogs did it every day. One of the most remarkable was a Doberman named Satan, who served with the French army at Verdun in 1916. While soldiers couldn't leave the trenches due to constant shell fire and snipers. Satan had been trained to run through danger, carrying a small message tube tied to his collar. Inside were notes, maps, medicines, and hope. Once, an isolated French unit was trapped in a collapsed trench, out of ammo, out of contact. Satan was sent with a desperate message: "We will die if no one comes." On his journey, Satan was shot in the leg, but crawled more than 2 kilometers under fire to deliver the message. The unit was rescued 3 hours later. Satan was just one of many. Nearly 20,000 dogs served during the war as messengers, medics, guards, mine detectors, and or simply as companions to men who were slowly losing the will to live. One German soldier wrote in his diary, "I no longer flinched at explosion, but when the dog died, I wept." These dogs didn't understand politics. They didn't know anything about the war. They just ran because a human called, and sometimes, between two lines of deaths, the only thing that could still move forward was a four-legged heart. Part 11. The Christmas Without Bombs. On Christmas Eve, 1914, the cold bit through every layer. The mud reeked of blood. Along the Western Front, thousands of British and German soldiers stared each other down from trenches, less than 100 meters apart. One wrong move, one glance too high, meant death. But that night, something no one expected happened. From the German trench came a quiet melody, Silent Night, sung in German. The British recognized the tune. They joined in, singing the same song in English. The battlefield hushed. One soldier later wrote, "That song tore through the hatred." The next morning, soldiers on both sides called a spontaneous ceasefire. They climbed out of the trenches, hands raised, weapons left behind. No bullets, no orders, just humans walking toward together. They shook hands, shared wine, traded chocolate for cigarettes, even played football in no man's land. A rag ball, two teams in muddy uniforms, laughter echoed where death had ruled. One German soldier showed a photo of his sweetheart. A British soldier gave back a matchbox carved with his mother's name. No politics, no slogans, just a few hours where humanity temporarily won. Part 12. The Scout Cat. In a war where even breathing could be fatal, one of the first early warning systems was a cat. By 1915, poisonous gases like chlorine and mustard gas had entered the battlefield. Gas masks didn't exist yet. Soldiers died not from bullets, but because they couldn't smell the death coming. After devastating losses, some French units began keeping cats in the trenches, not for rats, but for gas detection. Cats, with their sharp instincts and keen senses, reacted before any human could. When gas started seeping in, before it had smell or color, cats would hiss, bolt for cover, and vanish into the back tunnels. That was the sign. Soak a rag, cover your mouth, sound the alarm, hide. In some cases, A single cat saved an entire unit and then disappeared. No one knew where it came from. No one saw it leave. But when the cat ran, the man followed. One soldier rode up his four-legged scout. She never spoke a word, but she screamed silently every time Dad approached. Cats didn't fight. They didn't know sides, but in a place where even voices were drowned out, they became the last warning, spoken through panic, from the smallest heartbeat on the front. Part 13. The Soldier Who Didn't Die. In April 1917, during the brutal Battle of Vimy Ridge, a Canadian soldier named Richard Mercer was declared dead. A heavy shell buried him beneath earth and stone. His comrades searched for hours, found only his helmet and blood. He was listed as killed in action. A death letter was sent home, but 6 days later, as medics combed the battlefield for bodies, they heard a faint tapping from beneath the ground. Digging quickly, they found Richard, gaunt, dazed but alive. He had survived on trickles of rainwater seeping through the crack, and a biscuit in his coat pocket. He became known as the soldier who didn't die. In those 6 days, Richard had heard bombs, screams, and silence. He said, "I thought I was in hell, but it was only the waiting room between life and death." After the war, Richard refused medals and honors. He lived a quiet life and spoke of the event only once, in a letter to his grandson. "If a man can survive on rainwater and hope, maybe we are stronger than we think." His story wasn't about heroism. It was a reminder that in the mud, the blood, and the forgotten places, sometimes the will to live outlasts even official death. Part 14. The Loved Zeppelin. Zeppelin. Yeah, I think I speak it right. I think so. Amid skies torn by shells and smoke, a small balloon drifted above the trenches, not carrying bombs, not dropping gas. It carried a love letter. It began with Erich Vogel, a German soldier stationed near the Somme. Before the war, he had been a printer. Lucille, a French nurse, was once his pen pal through an international mail exchange. Then war broke out. They stood on opposite sides, unable to use mail. Erich had an idea. He wrote in invisible ink, rolled the letter into a tiny tube, and attached it to a homemade zeppelin built from parachute cloth and salvaged wires. He released it at night, just in the wind, and somehow Lucille received it. She wrote back, made her own balloon, and sent a reply. They fell in love by air. In their letters, they never spoke of war, only the moon over the trench, stray cats, childhood dreams. In her 7th letter, Lucille wrote, "If the world won't let us meet, let the wind do it for us." Once, a balloon was intercepted by a soldier, but instead of reporting it, the officer, who had once loved someone across the line, let it fly. The war ended. Both survived. They met for the first time, after 2 years of loving only through the wind. In 1921, they married. Their wedding invitation read, The wind did not betray us. Part 15. The 14-year-old who printed resistance. In a small northern French village during the winter of 1917, the land was under German occupation. The people had no weapons, no news, only fear. But in that silence, a 14-year-old girl picked up ink and paper. Her name was Clemence Durand. Her father was taken, her mother killed by a bomb. She lived with her grandmother, and a rusty old hand press her father left behind. Instead of hiding, Clemence did what no one dared. She printed anti-war leaflets. She handwrote short, defiant lines. "We are not dead. France will return. Don't trust silence." Then she printed dozens of copies, hid them in bread packets, tucked them in her skirt hem, and crept out at night to paste them on poles, slip them into German boots, or hide them under villagers' door. One night, a soldier found a flyer. The village was searched, but no one suspected. The dangerous rebel was a skinny child with braided hair and burning eyes. Clemence printed for 3 months. Then one day she was caught. During interrogation, she said, "I don't know how to shoot, but I know how to write, and I wanted them to fear my words." She was taken to a prison camp. After that, she disappeared from history. But 60 years later, in a demolished house, they found a rusted breast and one last leaflet, framed behind cracked glass. Freedom doesn't wait for you to grow up. Part 16. The chef and the soup that saved a village. In the winter of 1916, a small village near the Belgian border, war had stripped everything away: homes, food, even hope. The people were starving. Children collapsed from hunger and cold. Then a man appeared, not with a gun, but with a pot of soup. His name was John Murner, once a chef in Paris. When war began, he didn't go to the front. Instead, he went from village to village, cooking for civilians left behind. When he reached his village, there was nothing left to cook, just potato peels, corn husks, dry onion skins, grass stems, and rainwater. He said, "I'll make something so good even soldiers will stop fighting to smell it." John gathered everything scrap, lit fires with rotting branches, and taught children how to spark flames. He showed the elders how to cure scraps with salt. He turned what others called trash into hot, steaming soup. It was bland, but every day, over 80 villagers lined up, not just to eat, but to remember that they were still alive, still human. By March the next year, French troops arrived to liberate the area. They found a sign hanging on the door of a ruined home. "Here I boiled a soup that warmed the heart." John disappeared after the war. No one knows if he survived, but his garbage soup saved an entire village, not just with nutrition, but with hope. Now we move to part 17. The 12-year-old soldier. When the First World War broke out, most believed war was a business for grown men, but some children didn't agree. One of them was Sidney Lewis. a 12-year-old boy, British. He's British, who became a real soldier by telling a lie. Sydney lived in Suffolk, England. His father had served in the military, and the boy grew up hearing stories of battlefield glory. As the war escalated, Sydney refused to stay behind. He forged his age, claiming to be 18, and somehow he got in. No one suspected the boy who barely stood above his rifle, but with a serious face and a confident voice, Sydney was sent to the front lines in 1915. He fought in the Battle of the Somme, one of the bloodiest conflicts in history. One soldier recalled, "He fired the machine gun better than our unit leader, but during breaks, he kicked around his helmet like a football." His mother found out when she saw his name in the papers. She appealed to the War Office. After a year and a half in hell, Sydney was sent home, the youngest officially recognized soldier in Britain in World War I. He rarely spoke about what he'd seen, but later in life, Sydney told his grandson, "War isn't a game, but a boy walked into it because others made it sound like one." Now it's part 18. Let me check and have a look at it. Oh, this part 18 is about the vision that saved 196 lives. October 3rd, 1918, an American battalion was trapped in France's Argonne forests, surrounded by German forces on three sides. The Allies thought they were lost and began shelling their position. No radio, no runners. Wounded men screamed in the crossfire. Their last hope, a vision named Chère Amy. Chère Amy, French for dear friend, was a trained homing pigeon raised by the French but flying for the US Army. The unit had already lost two messenger birds. Chère Amy was their final chance. The commander tied a note to his leg. "We are trapped at the coordinates XX. Stop firing. 6 men alive." Chère Amy took off and was immediately hit, shot in the chest, wing, and lost an eye. But it kept flying. 25 minutes later, soaked in blood, barely alive, it landed at base, its leg shredded, the message dangling by a thread of flesh. The shelling stopped. All 196 soldiers were saved. Chère Amy was treated, lost one leg, but survived, and received a French Croix de Guerre for bravery. After its death, it was preserved and displayed at the Smithsonian Museum. On its tiny prosthetic leg was engraved, "Little bird, big heart." Now is part 19. Part 19 is the story about the clown mask that saved a life. In 1916, London, a man sat by a window, his hands trembling as he painted flesh-colored wax. His name was Francis Derwent Wood, a sculptor. But since the war began, he no longer made statues. Now he was rebuilding faces for men too broken to look in a mirror. Over 20,000 British soldiers returned from the front with faces shredded by bullets, fire, and shrapnel. They were alive, but no longer human in society's eyes. Many wore scarves year-round. hid indoors, even avoided their own children. Francis couldn't accept that. He opened a small studio called the Tin Noses Shop, a place where he patiently sculpted noses, eyelids, cheekbones with wax and copper. He spent hours painting skin tones with oil colors and attaching strands of real hair. Some masks were shaped like gentle clowns, a touch of humor, so the soldier could smile again, maybe for the first time in years. One man said, as quoted, "His mask didn't make me handsome, but it let my daughter look me in the eyes again." War doesn't just kill bodies, it kills identity. Francis didn't save their lives, but with wax, paint, and compassion, he gave them back their place in the world. Wow, that's precious. Now we move to part 20, Memories in a Tin Box. In 1917, while excavating an old wall, in 1987, while excavating an old World War I trench in northern France, a team of archaeologists uncovered a rusted tin box, barely the size of a hand. No name, no address, but inside was an entire world, buried for nearly 70 years. Inside the box, a photo of a young woman in a white dress holding lavender flowers. A silver ring etched with the words, "Je reviendrai." I will return. It means I will return. In English, a folded piece of paper with shaky handwriting. "If I die tomorrow, don't wait. But if I live, wait for me." And a half-smoked cigarette. That's the final thing. No one knows who the soldier was. Perhaps he meant to send it. Perhaps he buried it before battle. Perhaps he died or lived and never came back. But the box and its contents remained untouched. It was placed in a museum. Thousands came to see it, and they fell silent. Because it wasn't just relics. It was love suspended between life and death, a promise buried in the earth, a memory untouched by time. Wars built history, but sometimes a tiny tin box preserved the human heart. Now we move to part 21, the story about the woman who made bombs and died from them. War wasn't just fought in trenches. It was fought in factories, in rooms thick with smoke and the sharp scent of chemicals, and in the hands of women in coarse aprons who stirred explosives to make bombs. In 1915, over 30,000 British women worked in munitions factories. The job seemed safer than the battlefield, but it killed them silently, slowly. TNT, the main ingredient in bombs, was highly toxic. Every day, they inhaled fumes, handled powders until their skin turned yellow. Hair fell out and nails blackened. They were nicknamed canary girls, like birds in a mine warning of poison. Many collapsed at their stations. Some lost babies to chemical exposure. Entire factories exploded. One tiny spark could turn everything into flame. But they kept working, because if they didn't, the soldiers would have no ammo. They called themselves the soldiers without guns. After the war, most were forgotten. No statues, no medals, just a line or two in dusty ledgers. She died in the factory, so someone else could live at the front. Wow, that's tragic. Alright. Excuse me for the noise because I'm recording at my home. Actually, so my mom and my auntie keep doing some work in the kitchen downstairs. So this room is not completely isolated from the noise. So if you guys could support my channel, I could invest in a small studio with some kind of equipment to isolate the noise, so I could record the audio more efficiently. Thank you. Now we move to part 22. The mother who disguised herself as a soldier. In 1915, in northern France, a mother received word her 17-year-old son, an artilleryman, was missing in action. No body, no explanation, no official record. She refused to believe he was gone. 3 days later, she cut her hair, put on her late husband's uniform, adopted the name Louise Mercier, and volunteered to enlist. No one suspected her. She was short, quiet, and serious. After weeks of training, she was sent to the front, near her son's last known unit. Amidst shell fire and mud, she quietly moved between camps, asking questions. Some soldiers claimed to have seen a boy matching his description, possibly a prisoner. Eventually, she located a hidden prison camp, disguised herself as a nurse, and slipped into the medical list. Among the faces there, she recognized her son. That night, she let him out through the drainage tunnel and disappeared. No one ever discovered who she truly was. Now, we move to part 23. The dress shop that was a spy hub. In a quiet street in northern France in 1916, there stood a modest tailor shop called Chance Elise. Faded sign, floral curtains, dresses gently swaying in the window. Locals thought it was just a place for women to mend clothes and carry on through the war. But behind that curtain was a spy network. Elise, the owner, was a widowed seamstress who once trained in Paris. When the war came, she quietly joined the resistance, turning her shop into an intelligence hub. Inside dress linings were maps of German camps, messages written in invisible ink, hidden in spools of thread, and coded signals stitched into seams. She trained young seamstresses to blink in Morse, hide microfilm in hams, and send messages through lace orders. German officers occasionally visited the shop to have uniforms mended, never suspected anything. They saw only women quietly sewing, unaware that every stitch was a message slipping past enemy's lines. Elite networks supplied the Allies with vital intel for over 2 years. When the war ended, the shop closed. No Blake, no mention. Wow, that was hard. That was deep and epic in some way. I think so. Whoa, right. Now it's part 24. The mirror that deflected bullets. In the left breast pocket of many World War I soldiers, beside family photos, or folded letters. There sat a small, round mirror made of polished steel or silver, a quiet item, overlooked, but one that would sometimes turn fade away. At first, these mirrors were for shaving, checking wounds, or simply glimpsing a familiar face when days in the trench eroded one's sense of self. But soon, strange stories began to surface. A French soldier survived a direct shot to the chest. The bullet, the bullet ricocheted off the mirror. A British private caught in a shell blast was said when a mirror shards absorbed it. Shrapnel headed for his heart. More and more soldiers carried them close to the chest, not just for grooming, but for luck. Not every mirror saved a life, but after battles, medics often found bent, cracked, scorched mirrors with bullets lodged into them, just shy of piercing flesh. As the war wore on, some manufacturers engraved the backs of mirrors with a quiet prayer, a mirror for the soul, a shield for fate. After the war, thousands of mirrors were returned with the personal belongings of the fallen. Families kept them like sacred relics, because that small piece of steel had once stood between their sons and death. Part 25. The Wedding Beneath the Shelling. In September 1917, in the war-torn region of Europe, a couple held a wedding inside an underground bomb shelter. There was no white dress, no medal ring, no music, only distant shell fire, flickering oil lamps, and the silence of men too tired to celebrate. The groom was a British sailor. The bride was a French nurse. They had met at a frontline medical post, surrounded by the wounded and the smell of disinfectant. Their bond formed quickly, during moments stolen from chaos. When the soldier received orders to transfer, they arranged a wedding within hours. Fellow soldiers cleared a corner of the shelter, set up a wooden table with a tap. An old surgeon acted as the witness. The ring was a piece of copper wire. The cake, a hard loaf of black bread. Tin cups replaced wine glasses. The bride wore a uniform with her husband's coat over her shoulders. The ceremony was brief. Once finished, everyone returned to duty. No songs were sung, no vows were spoken aloud. The moment passed quietly, marked not by celebration, but by presence. Now we move to part 26. Silent guns and a strange meal. In the late December 1914, the Western Front near Lockestedt, Belgium, was soaked in rain and silence. German and British trenches faced each other less than 100 meters apart. Weeks of fighting had created a no man's land strewn with corpses and craters. Neither side dared step out. On Christmas Eve, instead of gunfire, a carol rose from the German lines. British soldiers paused, listened, and then sang back the same tune in English. There were no orders, no plan, but the fighting stopped. By morning, December 25th, German soldiers slowly emerged, hands raised. British troops did the same. They crossed the mud, approaching each other cautiously. There were no rifles, no resistance. In the middle of the battlefield, They began to share what little they had: cigarettes, biscuits, canned meat, chocolate, and strips of smoked sausages. Some brought out flasks, offering small sips of cheap spirits. Helmets became makeshift tables. Men sat in the mud, in uniform, and ate side by side. At some point, a few groups kicked around an empty tin can, improvising a game. No goals, no teams, just motion, laughter, and brief escape from the war around them. The truce lasted less than a day. By late afternoon, higher command on both sides ordered troops to return to position. Quiet handshakes were exchanged. The soldiers climbed back into the trenches. That night, the guns resumed as if nothing had happened. There were no formal records, no photos that captured it all, but hundreds of soldiers would later remember it clearly. The strangest meal they never had, when enemies sat together and war paused just for a moment. Part 27. Verdun, the name of a child born in fire. The Battle of Verdun in 1916 was one of the bloodiest of the First World War, lasting nearly 10 months and causing over 700,000 casualties. Shells fell day and night. The air was thick with smoke, ash, and decay. In the middle of this destruction, a child was born, where no one expected life to exist. The mother was a civilian woman from a village near Verdun. When the battle erupted, she and her family couldn't escape in the time. They took shelter in the cellar of an abandoned farm, surrounded by bombardment. There were no nurses, no clean supplies, no safety, just survivors, huddled together, rationing rainwater, stale bread, and fear. One evening in early March, as artillery thundered above, the baby arrived. It's a girl. The mother lay weak on the cold ground, wrapped in scraps of cloth, and warmed by the bodies of other women nearby. There was no loud cry. The explosions drowned out everything. Weeks later, the family reached a makeshift medical station. When asked for the baby's name, the exhausted mother uttered a single word: Verdun, not out of affection for the place, but to mark where her daughter had entered the world against all odds. The story of the girl named after a battlefield was preserved through medical records, aid reports, and later civil documentation. Verdun, a name tied to death, became the name of a fragile life, born in the heart of destruction. Now is part 28. Part 28. The letter carrier under fire. In the occupied zones of the First World War, not all resistance came from rifles. Some came from ovens. In 1915, a small village in northern France fell under German control. Soldiers took over the farms, homes, and bakeries. Locals were forced to cook and clean for their occupiers. One woman, a middle-aged baker, was ordered to continue baking cookies and bread for the German troops. No one knows who had the idea first, but soon a new ingredient was added into the cookies: laxatives, cursed from pills taken from a nearby medical post. The recipe looked the same: sweet, chestnut cookies with sugar and butter, but within hours of eating them, German soldiers began experiencing severe interruptions. Dozens were suddenly absent from duty, retreating urgently to latrines. Patrols were cancelled, orders delayed. Within 3 days, the small garrison was nearly immobilized, not by bullets, but by violent stomach distress. The sabotage was never discovered. Official reports only mentioned a possible foodborne illness outbreak and requested more medical aid. No one was punished, but the villagers never forgot. The story lived on in oral histories and a few scattered wartime notes. It was a quiet rebellion carried out in the kitchen, not on the battlefield, with floor, courage, and a handful of crushed hills. Part 29. The Fake Funeral in War. In a war where death was everywhere, some people had to die just to stay alive. In 1917, along the Italian front, a wounded soldier was evacuated from a mountain battle near the Alps. His injuries were severe, but he would be sent, but not fatal. Medics patched him up and noted that once recovered, he would be sent back to the front. For many, that meant a second chance at life. For him, it felt like a delayed execution. One night, a local nurse, who had known the soldier since childhood, quietly altered his medical file. She listed him as deceased from internal bleeding. His name was added into the casualty list. A symbolic funeral was held by his unit at an empty grave. But the soldier was not dead. He was hiding in the shallow crawl space behind a supply shed, surviving on food smuggled in by kitchen workers and nurses. He spent weeks in silence, reading and rereading the last letter from his mother, who now believed her son was gone. After nearly 3 months, the resistance network arranged his escape. He was transported across enemy lines inside a supply coffin filled with bandages and rations. No one inspected it. That man, after all, rarely caused trouble. His name remained on official war memorials. He never corrected the record. No one ever officially knew he survived. In the middle of the war that measured loyalty in blood, one man had to stage his own funeral, not to run from duty, but to escape the death sentence disguised as orders. Now we move to part 30, the donkey that saved lives. Before we start, let me take a sip of water. I have to clear out my throat. In World War I, the First World War, animals weren't just tools. They were at times heroes. In 1915, during the brutal Gallipoli campaign between Allied and Ottoman forces, a New Zealand stretcher-bearer named Richard Henderson was tasked with evacuating the wounded from front lines. The terrain was steep, cratered, and deadly. The wounded were trapped in trenches too narrow for cabs. There were no spare horses, no extra hands. One day, One day, Henderson found a small, frail donkey wandering alone, left behind the chaos. It was barely fit for labor, but it could walk. From that day on, he and the donkey became a team. Each day, under fire and through clouds of gas, Henderson led the donkey down into the battlefield. He gently strapped the wounded onto its back, walking beside it, never riding, always guiding. The donkey climbed hills slowly, unfazed by explosions, stepping over corpses, and through trenches, one patient at a time. Over the weeks, the pair rescued hundreds. Survivors would later say they never saw Henderson's face clearly, but they remembered the steady sound of a donkey's hooves approaching through hell. After the war, Henderson returned home quietly. He rarely spoke of what he'd done, but in New Zealand's Military Medical Museum, a small statue still stands, a man with a donkey, walking through war, carrying not weapons, but lives. Now is part 31, the photograph that never reached her. Buried in a quiet field, once scattered by war, a rusted box lays untouched for over a century. Inside, beneath scraps of dirt-stained paper, was a photograph, worn, faded, but still intact. A young woman smiled from the past. Sunlight caught in her hair, frozen in a moment that no longer existed. The box belonged to a soldier. He was young, barely out of school when he was sent to the trenches. He carried the photo with him through the months of mud, cold, and shell fire. It had been his anchor, his shield, a glimpse of the world he hoped to return to. But the return never came. His unit was destroyed, his name one of many on a long forgotten list. The box was left behind, buried with the collapse of the dugout, sealed in time. Decades passed, grass grew back, the field grew quiet again. Then, during a construction project, the box resurfaced. It was passed to a museum, then to a university, where students cleaned each page with care. The photograph drew silence. No one knew her name, but they understood her meaning. She had waited, and perhaps, in some way, she still was. Not all messages are delivered in time, but some, even when delayed by 100 years, still find someone to listen. Part 32. Poems in Sandbags. The trenches were damp and narrow, carved like scars across the countryside. Days blurred together, mud, smoke, cold meals, and waiting. The only color came from rust and blood. Yet, in one corner of a crumbling trench wall, someone had written lines of poetry, not carved, not etched, just penciled softly onto the side of the sandbag. They weren't grand or polished, just a few short verses, observations, hopes, a thought about sunrise, a line about silence, a memory of home. There was no name, no signature, only a date in a corner, barely legible now. Over time, new sandbags were added, old ones rotted. The poem was covered, then forgotten. But in 2017, during a reservation effort at an old battlefield site, one of the bags was carefully removed, and there it was, faint but still visible, a voice from the mud. Historians examined it, linguists debated dialect, but for most who read it, none of that mattered. What mattered was that someone, in the middle of the world falling apart, had chosen to write a poem, not to be published, not to be remembered, but simply to exist for a moment, for whoever might come next. In a place built to destroy, someone had left behind something to feel. That was the end of part 32. Now it's 33. The cartoon that saved a unit. It began as a joke, drawn in the margin of a supply ledger during a sleepless night. A crude sketch of soldier arguing with his boots, or maybe a pigeon wearing a helmet. No one remembered the first one exactly, but the man who drew it did so every night, quietly, with a stub of pencil and a fold of ration paper. Soon the cartoons multiplied. One was pinned over the latrine, another on the mess wall. A third found its way onto the side of an ammunition crate. The artist never signed his name, but his sketches gave the men something they hadn't felt in weeks: dread, humor, relief. They called it strange ink, not art, not propaganda, just truth, drawn with a crooked smile. The jokes weren't always funny, but they were human. In a place where everything was gray, the drawings gave color, if not to the sky, then to the mind. When morale broke during a brutal winter push, it wasn't orders that held the men together. It was laughter, not loud or defiant, but the quiet kind that reminds you are still alive, you're still yourself. The artist didn't survive the war. His notebook was found later, pages stained and worn, tucked inside a metal canteen. Some of drawings made their way into a museum. Others were copied by hand, passed among units like Lucky Charms. No monument bears his name, but in the middle of a war that tried to turn men into numbers, one cartoonist reminded a unit that they were still people, they are still human. Now it's part 34. Broadcast from the shadows. The signal was faint, barely a whisper among the static, but it was enough. Just a voice, calm and steady, speaking from somewhere behind enemy lines. Sometimes it carried a name, or poem, or the news of a town that still stood. Sometimes it was only music, played softly, as if not to wake the silence. The broadcast came at night, short and irregular. Soldiers on the Western Front began to listen in secret, tuning radios against regulation, hoping for that familiar crackle. They didn't know her name. They just called her the Night Voice. She was real, a young woman in occupied Belgium, walking alone in a hidden attic, transmitting through salvaged parts of a battery she had built herself. She risked everything. Her city was under German control. Spies were shot. Signals were hunted. But she kept broadcasting. Some said she was a ghost. Others claimed she was British intelligence. Neither was true. She was a local girl with no training, no orders, only a conviction that words, even whispered, could hold the line. The Germans tried to trace her. Trucks rode through neighborhoods. Attendants swept the skies. One night, the signal simply stopped. No one knows what happened. Her transmitter was never found. But months later, a battered notebook surfaced among Allied supplies. Pages filled with names, days, and fragments of her broadcasts, a war diary without a face. She had spoken into the dark, never knowing if anyone heard, and yet, for the men freezing in their trenches, her voice had been proof that they were not alone. That somewhere beyond the wire and barbed silence, someone was still calling out. Now it's past 35. The soldier who wouldn't leave. When the war ended, most returned home, some on trains, others in silence, carried beneath flags. But at the edge of a forgotten forest, in a crumbling barracks, long abandoned, one man stayed behind. No one knew his name at first. He had been found by local villagers months later, after the armistice, living among rusted helmets and torn canvas, cooking over a fire made from splintered rifle grates. His uniform was worn to threads, rank patches faded to gray. He said nothing. He simply stood each morning for roll call, even when no one else did. Doctors said he had survived a shell blast. Memory gone, records lost, no next of kin. He didn't ask questions. He just stayed as if the war had never ended. Seasons passed. The vines crept over the barracks. Rain slipped through broken roofs. Still he tended the grounds, straightened chairs, swept leaves from the steps. Some nights he lit a lantern in the window. Perhaps for comrades who would never return. People began to leave food near the fence. Children watched from a distance, calling him the last soldier. He never waved, never smiled, just stood guard, quietly, at a war that no longer existed. Years later, a historian found his name on a roster. A French infantryman listed missing in action, presumed dead, no medals, no grave. In time, he too disappeared, perhaps in the forest, perhaps into net, but the barracks still stands, half swallowed by moss and silence. And sometimes, on certain mornings, villagers say you can still hear boots on gravel, a ritual, a memory, a man keeping watch over ghosts. Part 36. The child born under fire. The town had been shelled for days. Smoke drifted low through shattered windows, and every footstep stirred dash where walls used to stand. What once was a schoolyard had turned into rubble, yet in a corner of the old stone fort, half buried and almost forgotten, a cry was heard. It was not a cry of pain, nor fear. It was the thin, sharp voice of a newborn. A child had been born beneath fire. The mother is a young local woman, had been hiding in the ruins with her family. The shells came earlier than expected. There was no doctor, no time, just bare hands, cold air, and instinct. When the town awoke the next day to brief silence, the news spread faster than fear. A baby had survived the bombardment. People called her Hope. That was not her real name, but it was the only one they used. She became a symbol, not of victory, but of survival. In the weeks that followed, she was passed gently from soldier to nurse, from priest to baker, as if the whole town needed to hold proof that life still chose to go on. Years later, a statue was raised in the market square. It did not carry a weapon or wear a medal. It showed a woman cradling a child, eyes closed, not in grief, but in breath. So, who walk past think it's a monument to motherhood, others to peace. But for those who remember, it marks the moment when, in the heart of destruction, something quietly began again. Part 37. Art from Shells. When the fighting paused, even for a day, the trenches exhaled, mud dried slightly. The world grew quiet enough to hear small sounds, boots scraping, spoons clinking, the soft click of a knife tapping metal. In one corner of a supply post, a French soldier sat hunched over an empty shell casing. His rifle rested beside him, untouched. His hands moved with careful rhythm, carving tiny shapes into brass, a flower, a swirl, a name. It had started as a distraction, a way to pass the dead time between fear, but it became something more. With each line etched into cold metal, he reclaimed a little piece of himself, not as soldier, but as a man who once sculpted wood, once gave gifts, once created instead of destroyed. Others joined in, spent bullets turned into rings. Shrapnel became brooches. Some decorated their cantons, others their helmets. It was not official, not ordered, but across the front, art bloomed quietly inside a storm. They called it strange art. Most pieces were lost, tossed aside in retreat, or buried with their owners. But a few survived, carried home in satchels, passed down two generations. One sculpture, made from bent artillery, shell and shaped like a dove, now sits behind glass in military museum. There is no label naming the artist, no photo of his face. Only the object remains, silent proof that even in war, some choose to carve beauty from what was meant to kill. Part 28. The classroom named after him. The school was small, just 4 rooms and a cracked courtyard where leaves gathered in autumn. Nothing about it seemed remarkable, except for brass plaque above one door. Classroom 3, Monsieur Darland. Most students never asked about the name. It had always been there, as normal as the creaking floorboards or the smell of chalk. But once a year, in early November, the head teacher would pause the lesson to tell the story again. Belland had been a school teacher here long before the war. He taught history and literature, though most remember him not for how he taught silence, pausing often, letting words settle. When the war came, he didn't wait to be called. He joined the infantry, telling his students only, "A teacher doesn't stop teaching, even when the classroom changes." He wrote letters from the front, sometimes including short poems, sometimes just a line for each child. One student remembered getting a leaf taped inside the envelope with a note. "This one fell near my boot. Keep it until I come back." He didn't come back. After the war, the village rebuilt what it could. The school was repaired, desks mended, windows replaced, but one thing was added: the plaque. Not as a grand gesture, not for politics or memory alone, but because the students had asked for it. They had waited. They had groaned. And when the door opened again, they wanted to learn in a place that still remembered who first showed them how. Show them how. Alright. Part 29. Part 29. The watch kept for 70 years. Wow, the watch kept for 70 years? It was a simple pocket watch, silver-plated, slightly dented, no engraving, the kind given to soldiers when they left for the front, part of their uniform, part of the rhythm of the war. But this one never kept time for its owner again. In 1917, 2 young men, friends since childhood, served in the same unit. One carried the watch, the other, quieter, often asked to check it, as if needing to believe the hour still mattered. Then one afternoon, in the smoke of a forest skirmish, a shell fell too close. When the dust cleared, only one of them stood. He found the watch in the mud, still ticking. The glass cracked. He wiped it clean and placed it in his own coat, not as a souvenir, as a promise. He returned home years later and kept the watch in a wooden box by his bed. He never wore it, never wound it, but he checked it each morning, as if remembering what it had survived and what had not. Time moved on, cities changed, hair grayed, but the box remained the same drawer, untouched except once a year, on the anniversary of that afternoon. In 1987, now an old man, he visited the home of his late friend's grandson. They had never met. He placed the watch in the boy's hands, said nothing, and left. The boy didn't understand the weight of it then, but years later, when he opened the lid again, he did. It wasn't just a watch. It was 70 years of memory held in silence. Okay, now come to the final part, part 14. The nameless uniform in the museum. In the museum, it hangs in a glass case near the end of the gallery. A faded green uniform, frayed at the sleeves, buttons mismatched, color threadbare, no name tag, no medals, no photograph beside it, just a small sign, unknown soldier, Western Front, 1916. Visitors pass by in quiet. Some slow down, few stops. It looks like all the others until you look closer. There is a patch, hand stitched at the elbow. A tear near the shoulder, sewn with thick black thread. A pocket slightly wrapped, as if something had been carried inside for a long time. Not gear, not a weapon, something softer. No one knows who wore it. It was recovered from a field hospital long abandoned, folded neatly beneath a bed frame. No records, no initials, no initials. The war had left too many nameless, but the curators kept it. Not for decoration, for witness. Each year, school groups visit the museum. They stand before the case and listen to a guide speak of battles and treaties, tactics and turning points. But then they look at the jacket and realize someone wore this. Someone ran through mud and fire in this. Someone breathed in it, waited in it, hoped in it. And even though no story is written beside it, the silence speaks louder than words. Because memory doesn't always come with names. Sometimes it remains in stitches, in fabric softened by fear and rain, in the spaces left open for those we'll never truly know, but must never forget, never forget. Alright, so that is the end of our stories today. Thank you for listening and watching my videos. You have a good night.